That was amazing. Quite impressive. I hope you'll enjoy this session as well. I'm really pleased to have a chance to introduce and then interview Mr. Tim Gould, who is the Chief Energy Economist of the International Energy Agency, which obviously has got to be the most important economist at the International Agency. Tim previously he headed up the oil supply part of the Global Energy Outlook research effort, which results in the world's benchmark report on the current status and future of hydrocarbons in the world, as well as renewable energy, which is put out every year by the International Energy Agency. And everybody who works in the energy sector waits eagerly for that report each year and its predictions. And earlier, my paths crossed with Tim when he was heading up the IEA's section on the former Soviet space, Russia, the South Caucasus, and Central Asia, so CAMCA. So Tim, I'm really happy to be reconnected with you. Oh, there I can see you on the screen. You look great and fresh. I wish you were here with us. And welcome to the CAMCA Energy Regional Forum. Tim, the people here in this room, some of them do have energy experience, and everybody is somewhat familiar with the geopolitical and geoeconomic significance of energy. But not everybody is familiar with the International Energy Agency. I personally, in my career, I loved working with you and your colleagues. I found the IEA, which is comprised of OECD countries, it's actually housed in Paris with the OECD. I found it a really valuable place, not only to have discussions and benefit from your research, but also as a convener. The IEA back then in 2008, 2007 played a really important role in stimulating discussions among countries and companies that over time led to the Southern Natural Gas Corridor. So before we get into the specifics, could you tell us a bit more about the IEA, what its role is, how it operates, and also its relevance to this region, since none of the CAMCA countries are OECD members?
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador, and it's a huge pleasure to join you. I'm sorry I'm not there in person, but indeed, you made a very kind introduction to the IEA and its work. We are celebrating this year our 50th birthday. So we were set up after the first oil shock in the 1970s as a way to sort of institutionalize a discussion around energy security and also to have some mechanisms to respond to oil supply disruptions when they take place. But since then, our ideas about energy security have broadened significantly. We talk a lot about gas. We talk a lot today about electricity. We talk about new issues on clean energy supply chains and critical minerals, all of the things that could affect the speed and the security and the affordability of the changes that we need to see in the energy sector if we're to avoid the sort of future that our previous speaker was talking about. And as part of that discussion, one of the priorities of our current executive director, who's Dr. Fatih Birol from Turkey, was to open the doors of the IEA to discussions with the key energy players of today, and not all of them, of course, are the current members of the IEA. So that means India, Brazil, South Africa, Indonesia, countries, of course, in Asia and in the CAMCA region as well. So we're very keen to develop further the existing discussions and dialogues we have with countries in the CAMCA region, and that's why I'm particularly delighted to have this opportunity today.
Great, thank you very much, Tim. So as you explained, the IEA was formed in response to the 1973-74 oil supply shocks. And a major role of it is to ensure, in terms of the calculus of energy security, right, that there's enough energy available at affordable prices, and in a sustainable way. So in terms of supply shocks, I think a lot of people, certainly in the oil sector, but probably in this room too, expected that when the Israel-Hamas war began, that we were going to see disruptions in supply and spike in prices, but that hasn't really happened. So from your and IEA's perspective, why have oil prices in these last 9 months remained relatively stable?
I think that's a great question. And certainly we're very conscious of the risks of instability in such an important region as the Middle East for global energy supply and exports in particular. And also the risks of the attacks that we've seen to shipping lanes in the Red Sea. All of that could well have added to tension in markets and pushed up prices. And it's a good question why that didn't happen. And I think you have to go back then to the fundamentals of where we are in markets today. On the demand side, there are uncertainties over the economic outlook, uncertainties over how much oil both the OECD economies, but also some big emerging players are really going to need. And on the flip side of that, we have a relatively ample supply picture for the moment. So new non-OPEC plus producers, Guyana, Brazil's producing a lot more at the moment, and the US, of course, as well. And what that means is that some other producers, notably the Saudis, have been cutting back on their own production. So at the moment, we have quite a large buffer of spare production capacity in the world. At the moment, even if you exclude sort of sanctioned barrels from Russia and Iran, that's close to 6 million barrels a day of spare production capacity in our view. And that gives a degree of comfort then to markets that, any unexpected shocks can reasonably be absorbed.
Extremely clear. And you're describing how the supply in the world is, I don't necessarily say in surplus, but there's plenty of oil out there. And one of the most publicized recent conclusions of the IEA was President Fatih Birol's and the agency's conclusion that the world really doesn't need any more greenfield investments upstream in oil and natural gas to meet supply, and probably shouldn't make those investments because of our climate change goals. So could you elaborate on that a bit more?
Yeah, I think it's important to unpick that a bit because if we start with the supply sort of picture, then we're missing a big part of that sort of logical process that leads us there. So what we were asked to do was to think through what it would take for the global energy system to play its part in the fight against climate change and the imperative to reduce emissions. And if we are to keep, the energy system in a state where emissions are reduced and we keep our way of life and our climate in recognizable, sort of within recognizable boundaries, then what we need to do is build up a cleaner energy system very rapidly. And there are opportunities to do that, and there are some mature clean energy technologies that, in a sense, are ready for the big time. And I'm happy to be talking more about that. But if we were to scale up that clean energy system rapidly, then of course we would need less of the fossil fuels. And in a world that keeps global warming to 1.5 degrees, those declines in fossil fuel demand would be relatively steep, such that you could meet that demand, through continued production and continued investment in existing fields, but you wouldn't need in aggregate to be developing new ones. Now, that logic doesn't work if you turn it on its head. If you don't build up the clean and you don't invest in your existing fuels, then you will run into difficulties. You will run into price spikes. But if you consider that as a package, then I think it gives important indications of what would need to change in order to get us on track to address the climate challenge.
Yeah, excellent point. There needs to be a massive increase in clean energy investment. I was at a conference in Baku last week. I think it was the head of the International Renewable Energy Agency who said that we had a good year last year. We had a record amount globally of investment in renewables. I think he said it was 473,000 megawatts globally, but we need 1 million per year. So our best year is still only getting us halfway to the target we need to meet every single year. And in the meantime, of course, everybody, we all want to move away from hydrocarbons as quickly as possible in terms of their emissions. But then what about all the countries in the lesser developed part of the world who have recently discovered oil and gas, as you mentioned Guyana, for example, and there are plenty of others. There's also an a question of equity or equitability. In other words, should they forego the economic development and the decrease in poverty that can come from them wisely investing in and producing and exporting their energy sources, or do we really need to keep our eyes focused on keeping as much of our investment on non-hydrocarbons, so on clean energy, as possible for the sake of the planet?
We start that conversation from a slightly different space. So we are the International Energy Agency. We recognize that energy is vital for the functioning of modern economies. And so, the starting point for all our analysis is how much energy do we need to meet our needs for light, for heat, for cooling, for all the things that make our modern lives work. And then we look, well, what sort of technologies and fuels do we need in order to meet that demand? And there are different ways in which we could look at that balance. And I think different countries will find different answers depending on their resources, depending on their ability to mobilize investment. But we would encourage all countries to look carefully at those choices, because in a sense, the choices that made sense 20 or 30 years ago may not be the choices that best prepare you for a different kind of energy system in the future. We are not dictating to countries what they should do, and it's of course the sovereign right of countries to choose their own path of development and how they pursue it. But we want to have an informed debate about those choices and the fact that cost competitive clean technologies can play a much larger role in the future than they have in the past. And they can also meet development needs of countries relatively cheaply and relatively effectively. They can't do everything, but certainly when we look at electricity, there are very, very attractive options now for meeting rising electricity demand with low emissions technologies. The industrial aspect, I think, is another area which we need to have in mind, because countries want to build up a modern infrastructure. They need cement, they need steel, and you cannot easily harness renewables to all aspects of those development objectives today. But that's where innovation is so important. That's where partnerships are so important, and that's where we need to make sure that there's an accessible flow of those innovative technologies also for countries in the CAMCA region and elsewhere.
Yeah. Two follow-up points. One, as we listen to Tim talking now, that was a great example, Tim, of sort of the physical and intellectual convening power of IEA. You're talking about the need to enable countries to be able to make their own smart choices and use their investment and their resources as equitably, but also as effectively as possible to spur economic development. Sometimes pejoratively, people might refer to the IEA as a cartel of the oil consumers, as opposed to the cartel of OPEC, or the oil suppliers. But as you listen to Tim, that's not at all what the IEA is. It's an organization that's trying to help all countries figure out the best way forward. And also, there's a crucial role in the energy transition for private investment. I mean, this can't happen without private investment, because that's where the technology is coming from. And so, Tim, in your last intervention, you mentioned a few times the importance of technological innovation to get us through this energy transition. And I remember a quote in Dan Yergin's The Prize. So for those folks who aren't energy specialists, The Prize is the quintessential, very thick book on the history of oil, written by a brilliant analyst named Dan Yergin. And there's a great quote in there that says, all of the world's major oil fields have been discovered. So from now on, there won't be any more oil, and so we expect the supply of oil to decrease for the rest of geological time. And that was written like in 1913 or something like that. So since then, we've had so many revolutionary advances in technology, whether it be deep water drilling in recent decades, or horizontal drilling and fracturing or fracking, that we have had enough oil. But there's also a question of when is there going to be peak oil demand? Because again, there's such an intense effort in moving toward clean energy. So, I mean, looking at your crystal ball, Tim, I know you guys do a lot of analysis of this question. What's your latest prediction?
Well, I think the first thing to say is there are some quite important structural changes taking place in today's energy sector. And just to give you one indication of that, if we look back to before the pandemic, there was just over $2 trillion going each year into the global energy sector. Investments in different bits of the supply picture, but also in energy efficiency improvements and sort of electrifying bits of the system. So just over 2 trillion, and that was split roughly equally between investments going into oil, gas, and coal on the one hand, and then on electrification, renewables, nuclear, and various other sort of energy transition related investments on the other. Now we have a situation where, in our view, there's going to be roughly $3 trillion going into energy investment this year, and just over 1 trillion, as before, is going into oil, gas, coal. But nearly 2 trillion is going to be going into those clean energy investments. And that means that we are seeing, quite big changes led by the electricity sector, but not only in the electricity sector worldwide. The challenge from our perspective is that pretty much all of the increase in clean energy spending has come from a handful of economies led by the advanced economies and China. So spreading that more widely, getting clean energy projects through, getting them financed is absolutely essential. So that's by way of background. And it starts to have quite interesting implications then for the trajectory of demand for all of the fossil fuels, and including, of course, oil. So in our view, you're going to see slowing growth in oil demand over the remainder of this decade. And we released actually yesterday new forecasts for oil demand to 2030. And we see oil kind of reaching that high point, call it what you will, a peak, a plateau, before 2030. So where, the demand for transport services can be met not only by oil, but by other energy sources as well, notably by electricity.
Mm-hmm. And even after that peak, for as long as our lives and our children's and grandchildren's lives will be active, I suppose we're going to need oil for all sorts of other industrial reasons as well. So it's not going to go away entirely, but the point is that we will reach a peak in demand. Yeah. Fair to say, Tim?
Yeah, we believe that's true. And I think, you need to separate out the different components of oil demand, and certainly the bit that lasts longest, even in very rapid energy transitions, is the bits that we use in industry, notably for petrochemical feedstocks. But many of the transport uses, starting with passenger transport, can be met cost competitively, in our view, by other means, and we will move increasingly towards seeing that happening. And there are some countries that are making very rapid strides in that direction. So it seems to us that this year in China, close to half of new vehicle sales will be electric. And not quite that level in most other countries of the world, with the exception of Norway. But that gives an indication of some quite important changes underway, because China has been, the driving force behind a lot of the developments in global markets. Some 60% of oil demand growth over the last 10 years came from China. 1/3 of global gas demand growth. So we need to watch what happens in a big player like China very carefully.
And yet China, as you mentioned, is probably the single largest investor by country in clean energy these days, in renewables, and has played such an important role in the decrease in the cost of photovoltaics and the panels, et cetera, and plays a huge role in the area of critical minerals, right? I mean, let's say cobalt, right, which a lot of it is mined in Democratic Republic of Congo. And Chinese companies and activities are responsible for a lot of that, but where China really has a huge bit of influence is on processing, right? With, I think, like 90% of that cobalt is processed in China. And in the United States, this is becoming, and in the European Union, a sort of a wake-up moment, creating a sense of crisis that while we so desperately need the energy transition to succeed, so many of our eggs are in China's basket. So I know you've done some work on this issue too. How worried should we be that we are so dependent on one country, whether it's China or the United States or any country, one country not only for the technologies at an affordable cost, but also the crucial minerals?
I think you've characterized it extremely well. And indeed, I think particularly after the experiences with the global energy crisis, the vulnerability that was felt in Europe and more broadly and because of high reliance on imports of Russian gas, I think we've all become even more aware, if we weren't aware enough already, of the difficulties that can arise when you're excessively dependent on a single country, a single trade route, a single source for an important aspect of your energy system. And I think, you know, some of that awareness, of course, is rightly put on the high degree of geographical concentration in clean energy supply chains. You've pointed out this midstream of the critical minerals process. So all of the refining, processing, cobalt's a good example, but there are many other examples, including graphite and rare earths, the battery metals that we need for a more electrified system, components that go into electric motors for wind turbines, for EVs and so on. And I think that degree of concentration is a concern because, you know, it's one of the lessons that you'll also find in the Bryza, the book that you referred to earlier, that we need to be thinking about the diversity of the system if we want to, you know, if we want to have a very secure and resilient system. And so it's encouraging to see many parts of the world, including the US, I mean, including Europe, but including more broadly, and I know it's a big topic in Kazakhstan, looking for opportunities then to, you know, bring alternative new supplies to market, you know, build up new supply chains for what seems to us to be, you know, critical areas of the new clean energy economy. And it's not surprising that, you know, given the, you know, the size of future demand for these technologies, that many countries are then competing to find their place in this sort of new industrial clean energy architecture.
Yes, so obviously a great opportunity for some in the CAMCA region, right, with large deposits. You mentioned Kazakhstan, of all sorts of crucial minerals, and lots of copper in the region, gold, a lot of iron here, but iron probably is not so important to this energy transition as it was in the previous industrializations. But hanging over this region is Russia. And you mentioned the natural gas problem or crisis in the European Union and how dependent Europe allowed itself to get. And that's how we met each other, Tim, way back when I was bouncing around Europe doing my best to persuade our European allies that they were really maneuvering themselves into a strategic corner by being so dependent on one supplier of such an important commodity. And I'll never forget, I was having a meeting with, I think he was the Deputy Minister of Economy of Germany at the time, and as you know, economy and energy are one ministry in Germany. And so we had gone on for about a half an hour, and I was making my arguments about the danger of being so dependent on Russia for its natural gas and how many of our European allies are so dependent. And he very politely, but at about the half an hour mark, he said, okay, I think we need to end this meeting. I'm going to ask you to leave. And I said, okay, well, it was okay. He said, yeah, the problem is we really don't think it's appropriate for United States government officials to be telling European officials, especially us here in Germany, what to do about our energy supply mix, and Russia's been a reliable supplier for all of these decades. Well, we all know what happened after February 2022, yet a great news story is how quickly and efficiently Europe, especially Germany, pivoted away from Russian natural gas. Lots of analysts were predicting there would be an economic collapse in Europe if natural gas from Russia was cut off. So, Tim, how well do you assess Europe and the European Union as having performed in this pivot away from Russian gas? And are they out of the woods, do you think? I mean, there's been a significant amount, I think, of demand destruction for natural gas in Europe. So as we look ahead to this next winter, if it's cold, do you think Europe will be okay?
But that's another great question. And you know, very quickly after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we came up with our own ideas about what Europe could do to reduce its reliance on Russian natural gas supply. So we came up with a sort of 10-point plan within 10 days of the invasion. And I think if you look at how Europe has coped, then there's a number of elements in play. Some of them were sort of fortuitous external circumstances. In a sense, we had a succession of relatively mild winters. China was taking less from international markets in 2022, 2023 than it would normally do. and that allowed for a bit more flexibility in the system. But you've had a combination of supply and demand side reactions. On the supply side, others, notably the US with LNG, but also Norwegian pipe gas, stepped in and stepped up. And I think that was a very important validation of some of the changes that have been taking place in natural gas markets, more flexible, more liquid, more responsive to supply-demand signals. But on the demand side as well, there was a series of measures that were taken, some of them more structural, efficiency improvements, stepping up investments in renewables, and some of them, as you rightly point out, more damaging. There were real pressures on gas-intensive industrial sectors in Europe who dialed back their production because they simply they couldn't compete anymore on international markets. And there's a continued discussion now in Europe about what this new world looks like for Europe's industrial competitiveness in a world where they no longer have access to Russian gas. But I think the bottom line is that Europe came through more strongly than many had hoped or feared, and they are now well positioned, it seems, even in event of a cold winter. The gas storages are relatively well filled. I think there's ability now to bring LNG to all parts of Europe. The infrastructure has worked reasonably well. So I feel like Europe is in a much better place now than it was.
Yeah, that is really a remarkable picture you just painted. And yeah, I remember your 10-point plan, and it was visionary and exactly the right set of measures to take. And yeah, it has worked. But natural gas still remains controversial in Europe and in renewable energy circles because it is a hydrocarbon. It does release CO2. It's twice as clean or half as dirty as coal in terms of emissions, but it still is a hydrocarbon fuel, and a lot of folks think that maybe we should focus all of our energy, so to speak, on renewables. But it seems natural gas is a crucial transition fuel. I think back to, again, a Germany example. Back in the 70s and 80s, Germany had the Energiewende policy effort to develop renewable energy technologies. It was a great success. And the United States, though, got lucky with its own technological developments in terms of the fracking revolution and horizontal drilling that I mentioned, so shale gas. And so what happened was there was a massive increase in natural gas production in the United States thanks to these new technologies. And the U.S. shifted from coal for power generation largely to much cheaper natural gas produced domestically. And that led to the United States meeting its Kyoto Protocol targets, if you remember the Kyoto Protocol, which the United States never committed to meet, but the United States just did, thanks to this technological revolution. And Germany, which worked so hard on developing these technologies that we're benefiting from today, ended up buying that displaced US coal, which became cheap, and ended up missing its Kyoto targets. So the question is, for the European Union, where there is a commitment to stop using natural gas, and I forgot when that is, you'll know, how do you simultaneously have enough guaranteed purchasing in the future to finance the investments needed today in natural gas to help Europe get through the transition?
Again, it's a great set of questions, and I think gas has proved to be a very versatile and flexible energy source for many countries. And I think it does perform all sorts of different useful functions in the system, but it's difficult to be categorical about, is it always helpful for transitions or is it always unhelpful? Because it really depends on the context. It depends on the country situation. It depends on their alternatives and the costs and everything else. But by and large, what we see over the next few years is that the conversation on gas is likely to change. At least here, but in many other parts of the world, the conversation over the last couple of years has been about worries on security, on price spikes, on availability. But there is a big new wave of LNG export facilities coming into operation in the second half of this decade, say from 2026, from the US, from Qatar, from a number of other countries. And so I think, we're going to be moving from a conversation about scarcity to a conversation about relative abundance and what that means then for choices in different parts of the world. And I think on balance, that will help the conversation in a number of countries. But we need to be aware, particularly in the CAMCA region, that it's about the role that a modern gas infrastructure, a modern gas system can play in complementing the shift to cleaner sources of energy. I think, when I look at this region, I also see problems of, old aging infrastructure, sometimes methane leaks to the atmosphere, subsidized prices that stand in the way of some of the changes that we would need to see to move towards investment in a more modern and cleaner system. So I think there's an important conversation to be had about the role of gas in different parts of the world, but it will be taking place in a slightly different market context in the next few years than we've seen in the last few.
Tim, thank you so much. We ran out of time, but you were brilliant. You're so clear, concise, and you think in paragraphs in a way that is so linear and understandable. I'm really grateful to be reunited with you, and I would love to continue this conversation for hours and days, and I hope to do that with you in the future. So everyone here at the CAMCA Forum, many, many thanks, Tim. That was totally enlightening.